Welcome to Sci-Fi Secrets. This is part 2 of my Ringworld series, so if you haven't seen part 1, the link to that video should be on your screen now, as long as I haven't forgotten. So, when we left off, the ship had just crashed into the Ringworld, and the slaver stasis field saved the crew once again. So, let's get back into it. When the slaver stasis field turned off this time, they were on the surface of the Ringworld, with an enormously long path of destruction strung out behind the ship, caused by their impact with the rapidly spinning Ringworld floor. They get out of the ship and find that their crash has cut through all the dirt on the floor of the Ringworld, and their ship is sitting directly on an amazing substance that holds the Ringworld together. They call this substance Skrith. It's a metallic substance so strong that it's orders of magnitude stronger than carbon nanotubes in its tensile strength. The dirt that had been above it had been turned into lava by the force of the impact, so Lewis, in his insulated pressure suit, climbed up the hot wall and took a look around. Thankfully, they seemed to have crashed in an unpopulated area, the center of a desert to be exact. They removed their fly cycles from the now useless ship, and after several hours of work, as the shadow square began to pass over the sun, the crew faced its first night on the Ringworld. They lifted off in their fly cycles and began to head for the closer rim wall. The only problem was, these walls were 1,000 miles tall on both sides of the ring, but from where they were, neither wall could be seen. They may well be in the exact center of a 1,000,000-mile wide strip of land. But nonetheless, they had to make a decision. They chose a wall and began to head in that direction. The silver string that was the trench their ship had plowed in its crash faded behind them, but the giant mountain in the distance hardly changed its size. It must be enormous. The scale of the Ringworld was deceptive. Lewis looked out into the infinite distance. The world had no curve to it. There was no horizon. Instead, the distortion and size of distance just blended to a point where the mind could make no sense of it. It was intoxicating, hypnotizing. After hours of flying, Lewis turned the controls of his fly cycle over to Nessus, and he fell asleep. When he awoke, Speaker was controlling all 4 fly cycles. Lewis looked at the holograms of his crewmates' faces in their holographic projections on his dashboard. Tila looked at peace. A little too at peace. When Lewis asked her a question, she made no reaction whatsoever. Lewis told Speaker to land the fly cycles. He dropped them down in altitude and was searching an open place along a river when he came upon them, a group of natives fishing in the river. Clearly human. They took off and flew away to find another place to land, confused. How did humans get on a structure beyond human capability and outside of human-known space? And why were they apparently in the Stone Age? What is this place? Tila eventually came around and started acting normally again, as Lewis predicted she would once they were on the ground. He saw the look in her eyes before, on the world plateau. A world where the only habitable part of the planet was the top of a massive plateau. The rest of the planet was far below, with much higher pressures and a toxic atmosphere. But on this world, there was a popular tourist site where a massive river went off the edge of the plateau, plummeting 40 miles below where it disappeared into the formless white mists that covered the rest of the planet. From that spot, many people had gotten lost in their minds as they stared into infinity. The human's mind can't grasp infinity. It has a strange effect on it, an effect similar to hypnosis, but without any commands. The person would just stare into infinity until something or someone forced them away from the view. The infinitely flat Ringworld had the same effect on Tila. On Earth, the curve of the planet only let you see so far. The Ringworld was perfectly flat from side to side, and the curve of the ring around the star was so gentle that it was impossible to detect from the surface, even with a powerful telescope. And the curve was in the wrong way. Where the curve of the Earth hid, the curve of the Ringworld revealed. but at such a distance as to mean nothing to the human senses. In the dark of the Ringworld night, they could see a light blue and dark blue, almost black, checkered arch come out of the ground far in the distance and travel up in the sky, cutting it in half. They returned to their sky cycles and traveled on, not wanting to be on the ground at nighttime. Eventually, they came across the ruins of a once floating city. Castles and buildings of all types that at one point had ramps and stairs running up to them, but were now crashed into the city below. The floor of the Ringworld was apparently magnetic, which allowed the buildings to float. One of the buildings had smoke coming out of it. They landed and met their first natives face to face. Humanoid, and clearly human, but not of any race known on Earth. Their fingers were longer, they were shorter, and their facial hair was more like a monkey's, covering everything but their eyes. As their puppeteer-made translators picked up on the language, it was clear they thought the crew were gods, until Lewis laughed at them. Then they thought they were demons and attacked. Speaker killed several as they escaped, and Nessus killed one that tried to capture him. Kicking the man once in the chest with his powerful rear hoof was all it took. Tila had escaped at the first sign of trouble, and luckily for Lewis, they were small enough that he could just toss a few aside to escape. So, the crew flew on, mostly unharmed. As they flew along, they had a lot of time to think. A thought struck Lewis. Nessus had made an offhand statement about how they wouldn't even have needed to leave the ship if they had a starseed lure, a term new to Lewis. He had said they were a simple device, and his race had used them for thousands of years. They would attract a starseed, a giant interstellar life form that traveled around on its own solar sail. The Outsiders, for unknown reasons, followed these creatures around the galaxy. This seemed like innocuous information at first, but then Lewis realized that the only reason the Man-Kzin wars were won by man was because a starseed had shown up at a human colony. And that colony had bought the blueprints for the quantum hyperdrive off of the Outsiders that had followed it there. For an enormous amount of credits, by the way. When confronted with this information, Nessus freely admitted that the puppeteers did indeed direct the Outsiders to a human colony, in the hopes of domesticating the Kzinti. The humans were already useful to the puppeteers, but the Kzin were just a danger, a pack of murder kitties. But by having the most aggressive of them die in the Man-Kzin wars, generation after generation, only the most docile Kzin survived to pass on their genes. This had a noticeable effect on the Kzin species. For the first time in their history, they went 200 years without a major war with anyone, including themselves. But as they discussed, accused, and berated each other, more information kept coming out. It turns out that the puppeteers had also had a human breeding program. They had bribed and blackmailed the Earth government into creating the birthright lotteries, the same birthright lotteries that Tila Brown was the 6th generation winner of. Every one of her ancestors for the last 6 generations had won the birthright lotteries to have the kids that eventually led to Tila herself. It was the entire reason she was on the mission in the first place. Needless to say, both Speaker and Tila were quite upset with Nessus and his whole species. With Tila, this might lead to a few hostile looks and sharp words. But with Speaker, he had sharp claws and teeth in mind for how to deal with Nessus. So, Nessus fled the group. The crew was in shambles, Speaker and Tila emotionally broken and wanting to be left alone. Lewis, not wanting this to happen on a strange world in the middle of an accident that stranded them on an alien artifact outside of known space, tried to get the group back together. But nobody else wanted to cooperate, except Nessus, who, to be honest, Lewis was also a bit upset with. Tampering in other species' genes? Breeding them like cattle? It was insulting, and it was also partially Lewis's fault. Not the breeding program, but Lewis's sense of humor. He was beginning to make it a habit to laugh at the wrong times. First, he laughed at the natives, who thought he was a god. Then, he laughed at Tila, when, right after defending what Nessus did to Speaker, she found out that Nessus had done the same to her. and she was embarrassed as well as upset. And Speaker, of course, rubbed it in, and all Lewis did was laugh at her. Everybody was a jerk as far as she was concerned. So, when Lewis first called her, she hung up on him. But after they had landed and she had found a beautiful, secluded pool to relax in, Lewis found her and apologized, and she let him. At least 2 of the 4 members were back together. Speaker was still upset, but not at Lewis, and he felt that he and Tila shared the same shame. So, without any enthusiasm, the group grew back to 3. Lewis still wanted Nessus to return, at least for the sake of the mission, but neither Tila nor Speaker had any interest in that. Then, suddenly, it happened. Speaker, in the lead, was accosted with an attack of light. But this was no laser beam. It was a plant, the Slaver Sunflower, a plant that grew a convex mirror as one large flower on the top of a sturdy stalk. Much like a normal sunflower, but with a mirror for a head, that it could both move and focus on anything around it. Just one was enough to set fires and kill birds and small animals, but here was a wild patch of millions of them, and even though Speaker was a good way in the air, the millions had all focused on him and basically set him on fire as he flew, burning all the fur off any exposed part of his body. Lewis took control of Speaker's fly cycle and steered him away from the danger as he was blinded by the light. Speaker was lucky to survive, and even luckier that Nessus had somehow obtained military medical supplies for Kazin. But now it was not just his tail that was naked. He retained a puff of fur from where he was sitting on the seat, and he had shaded his eyes with his arm, so there was a strip of fur there, but the rest of him was hairless and burnt. As they flew on, they discovered a large floating castle with a torn-off stairway leading partially to the ground. Inside were many wonders, including a Bandersnatchy skeleton and an enormous glass-bottom pool at the bottom of the mansion. There was a bedroom with a bed big enough for a herd of elephants. There was a throne room with a bust of a very regal-looking man's face, and on top of it all, a giant map room, with the entire Ringworld laid out on its side. Speaker was able to find controls that gave video apparently shot from the shadow squares far above. In this video, they found a magnetic tramway at the top of the walls, active spaceports, and bustling, advanced cities. It seemed they had found civilization at last, until Speaker zoomed in on the castle they were currently in. The city below it was alive with life, looking pristine, but a look out the windows showed a much different scene. A ruin, old, destroyed, overgrown with vegetation and debris. The videos were clearly old recordings from the heyday of this civilization. Were they the ones that built this Ringworld? The bust was very human-looking, but it lacked hair on the top of the head. The people in the videos seemed to have the same look about them. So, a branch of humans created the Ringworld? How? Lewis suggested the idea of parallel evolution when they had seen the first natives, but Nessus had immediately shot down the idea as fiction. So, at what point in human history did humans leave Earth to make this? Or, did humans come from another world entirely? Was Earth not the home of humanity? On the map, they discovered a strange area. For some reason, the Ringworld creators had made relief maps of what looked to be 10 worlds in the middle of one of the 2 great oceans. 2 opposing oceans on opposite sides of the ring to balance the weight. Each one vastly bigger than the surface area of any known habitable planet. And in this one ocean were planet-sized island chains. Were these the worlds the people of the ring came from? Carved into the ring for sentimental reasons? According to the map, they were still around 200,000 miles away from the ring wall. They had already traveled over 100,000 miles, more than twice that left to go, in the hopes that they would find civilization at the rim. And if they did not? The crew, minus Nessus, spent some time at the castle resting and relaxing. But the next morning, a strange thing was happening. The sky was glimmering. In his sleep-addled mind, Lewis took a moment to notice what was actually happening. A very fine black string seemed to be falling out of the sky endlessly, covering the floating castle and the land below. While he was looking down at the string, he noticed that a crowd was forming far below his feet. Natives. What were they doing? He took his fly cycle down to see and met a preacher. The preacher informed him that the castle was known as Heaven and that a god used to live there. But at one point in the past, the people rebelled and the god left. After that, a famine started, and they wished for the god to come back. They would pray at the altars they made below Heaven to pray for him to come back. When the string began to fall, they took it as a sign and came to worship. Then Lewis, on his flying machine, descended from the sky. Was the god returning? But their conversation was interrupted when Lewis's translator suddenly began to give an automated warning, and then caught on fire, hurting Lewis's hand in the process. Lewis retreated back up into Heaven, where he learned that all three of the translators had burnt out at the same moment. Speaker had been hurt even worse than Lewis, but Tila had not been injured at all. They now had no functioning translators. The three continued on, leaving Heaven and the worshippers below in the past. They continued on their journey to the ring wall, and in the distance, a disturbing sight loomed up out of the infinite horizon. The Eye of God. Lewis thought he was losing his mind. An enormous blue eye was looking right at him. It must have been at least 100 miles across and 50 miles tall. If it would have blinked at him, he may have lost his mind at that exact moment. Tila must have seen it because she screamed. Lewis could see her terrified face on his dashboard. Lewis, grasping for any hold on reality, asked Speaker what he saw. "A human eye," he replied. This was actually reassuring to Lewis. If it was supernatural, then the Kazin should see a Kazinti eye, or nothing at all. He began to try and lighten the mood, suggesting maybe it was just a meeting sign for an optometrist's convention. But Speaker took it as a challenge. He wanted to fly right into it. Tila, now assured it was not supernatural, wanted to investigate also. Lewis was convinced she had never learned any concern for her own safety, and it seemed he was right. Lewis, on the other hand, did not want to fly right into something so strange and unknown, so he contacted Nessus, who immediately understood the implications. Hurricanes and tornadoes on planets spin the way they do because of Coriolis effect. But on the Ringworld, there is no Coriolis effect. There is only the spin of the ring, so the spin imparted to any storm is offset 90 degrees from a storm on Earth. They really were looking into a giant eye, the eye of a hurricane on the Ringworld. But what had caused it? On Earth, even today, planes regularly fly into hurricanes. The fly cycles that the crew were on put most jets to shame. So, Nessus reassured Lewis that it was perfectly safe to fly into the storm. So into the Eye of God they flew to investigate its cause. They pulled up to the center of the storm, flying high above. Lewis could see what looked to be a puncture in the floor of the Ringworld. He was so fascinated with it that he didn't notice Tila take command of her own fly cycle and go in for a closer look. Too close. She lost control of her fly cycle and was getting sucked out into space through the hole in the floor. But maybe Nessus's breeding program worked after all, because as Tila passed out, she must have somehow activated an emergency boost program that Nessus had kept secret in case he needed to run from his own pursuing crew members for any reason, which had already happened when Speaker discovered the puppeteers helping the humans with the starseed. So, an unconscious Tila escaped almost certain death, but now she was flying away in a random direction at Mach 4, faster than the other cycles could chase without Nessus's help. So, Speaker allowed Nessus to return to the group without trying to kill him. Nessus had trackers on all the fly cycles and could track Tila with them. When she regained consciousness, they began to lead her back to the group when suddenly they lost all communications with her. While trying to find her, Speaker and Lewis suddenly lost control of their fly cycles and were forced into what seemed to be an ancient police station. Apparently, they had been speeding, and the automated systems had confiscated their vehicles, with them still riding them. But the station was derelict. They were brought into a room full of other floating vehicles, and just left there, 100 feet above the floor. As they studied their situation, they noticed that there were skeletons in some of the other vehicles, and more skeletons on the ground from those that jumped. This automated system had been collecting occupied vehicles for centuries, just to force their occupants to either die of dehydration as they hung above the floor, or to jump to their deaths to end their suffering. And now it had done the same to Lewis and Speaker, holding both of them upside down because of how the fly cycles were made, combined with the non-magnetic creatures on them acting as unbalanced weights. Speaker's hand was injured by the translator burning out, and he was not the kind of cat that could climb anyway. He was useless in this situation. But Lewis was no climber, and he was pinned in place with the crash balloons. He had to pop a balloon with his laser flashlight, the beam narrowed to a point. Then, before he fell, he would have to grab the cloth of the popped balloon. Not an easy feat, but somehow he managed it, only to then be stranded on top of his fly cycle, or on the bottom of his fly cycle, unable to move for fear it might spin from his weight and throw him to the floor below. While stranded there for hours, he noticed a native looking down at him from a platform above. She looked very similar to the bust in heaven, but much more feminine. She had no hair on the top of her head, just a crescent around the back of her head from one ear to the other. That hair was long, dark, and full. Her features were much less pronounced than even Tila's. She had thin lips and a small mouth. By comparison, Lewis looked like a caveman with his heavy brows and thicker lips. And that is exactly what she must have taken him for. Another savage native, for she did not try to talk to him, she just dispassionately watched from above. Thankfully, Nessus had a plan. He would intentionally get caught in the same system that Lewis and Speaker did, but he would turn off his fly cycle's motor so it was not burnt out by it. This seemed to work, and now Nessus was trapped also, but he also had the TASP, the device he used on Speaker when Speaker tried to steal the long shot. A device that caused incredible ecstasy in those Nessus used it on. Nessus began to use the TASP on the woman at a lower setting. Every time she was in the room with them, Nessus used it on her, making her want to be around them more, making her not want them to die. Eventually, she released them from the magnetic field after a torturous 20 hours of Speaker being held upside down until he lost consciousness, and Lewis precariously balancing on top of the bottom of his inverted fly cycle without food or drink. Her name was Hilarlo Prillalar, or Prill for short, and as Nessus learned her language, they found out more about her in the Ringworld, or at least her version of the truth. I don't know if she was lying, or if this was the story she was told and she honestly believed it, which is what I think, but she only knows half of the story of the Ringworld, if that. But that is for later videos. Prill tells them that when she was younger, the Ringworld was alive and bustling. They even had an interstellar empire. Prill tells them that the Ringworld was built by her people, and that they inhabited 10 worlds before the ring. The 10 worlds in relief in the Great Ocean. Once the ring was created, they all moved into it, and the worlds were abandoned. But there were things that they either couldn't grow in the constant noon of the ring day sun, or were too dangerous to transport to the ring. So, they still flew ships to the old planets to get prized meats, herbs, and spices. She worked on one such vessel. It would make a loop of 4 planets before coming back to the ring, then do it over again. Prill had been on the loop 8 times. When relativistic effects are included, this means she was already hundreds, if not over 1,000 years old, when the ring collapsed. The theory she was told is that all the trash and debris left on the 10 abandoned planets caused a mold to mutate to eat the superconductor they used in all their high-tech machinery. The ships like hers somehow contracted it when they were doing their normal business and brought it back to the Ringworld, where it ate all the superconductors on the entire ring. But they had forgotten how to make devices without this substance, So, as it disappeared, so did their society. The ring is artificially made. It is just a few dozen yards of dirt over a steel frame. Once society collapsed, there was no way to recover from it. How could man outgrow the Stone Age when there were no mines, no metals, no veins of ore? The only hope was to learn how to mine the impervious Ringworld foundation, but anyone who learned how to do that would find a nasty surprise at the bottom of their hole one day, and then they would be dead, sucked out into space. So, her crew returned to the ring one day to find that no one would answer their hails. The acceleration rings were not responding. They were trapped outside with no way in. They used the ship's thrust to match speeds with the ring and made a dangerous landing, only to discover that now they were trapped on the wrong side of the rim wall. The device that allowed them to literally walk through the ring wall was no longer functional. One of the members of the crew was smart enough to figure out how to repair it temporarily. Without the superconductor, it could burn out at any time, but they risked it and made it through the rim wall, only to discover that the entire ring had turned to barbarism. With their advanced knowledge and long lives extended by the drug they had access to before the fall, they played the role of gods, a pantheon of gods. They survived by tributes brought to them, but Prill wanted to find her home city and traveled on. But her city was just as destroyed as the rest of the ring, so she took up residence in one of the few remaining flying buildings, the police station. And that is how Prill lived for over the past millennia, fed by the worshippers that brought tribute below, but with no goal, no life, no equals, until Lewis, Speaker, and Nessus appeared. The crew, now believing that they knew all there was to be learned on the Ringworld, let depression set in. There was no civilization. There was no one capable of helping them. There were no functional ships left, and even if there was no way to get through the ring wall. But Lewis began to come up with a crazy idea, a last-ditch hope of getting out of there. But where was Tila? After being lowered to the ground and recuperating, Lewis noticed that there were actually 4 fly cycles in the cells, but no body of Tila. She must have fallen from her fly cycle when it was neutralized. She was traveling at near Mach 2 when it was disabled. She must have been thrown from her seat. Her corpse could be anywhere. There was no real hope for her survival, and nothing could be done about it. With Speaker, Lewis, and Tila's fly cycles all destroyed, they came up with another plan. They would use Nessus's fly cycle to push the floating police station. That was their new means of transport. It was much slower going, but it was also much more comfortable. They were not far on their way when a strange noise got Lewis to look down in the cells again. A new vehicle was there, and there was someone inside. The station had captured another speeder. He got Prill to release the vehicle, and out come Tila Brown and Seeker, aka Gigachad. Tila had made it safely to the ground, where Gigachad had found her and protected her. He knew enough about the old systems to know that most people, when their vehicle was taken, would shut off their motors, so the system did not burn them out. They would do what Nessus did. So, some of the vehicles were still functional, despite their drivers being long dead. Seeker and Tila found one such vehicle and tried to chase the station, only to be caught in the same web all over again. Seeker was born not long after the fall. He had killed what he called an evil sorcerer, and had taken his supply of the booster drug that Prill also used, extending his life. This was near 1,000 years ago, so it seemed that both Lewis and Tila had found 1,000-year-old lovers in the short time that Tila had been gone. But Tila did not come back to rejoin the crew. She came back to say goodbye, or more accurately, she came back because Seeker thought Lewis owned her, and his honor would not allow him to take another man's woman. So, rather than try to explain to Seeker, Lewis just sold her to him for a dose of the anti-aging drug. He could bring this back to known space and become disgustingly rich if he desired. They have booster spice on Earth, but it's not nearly as good as this drug. Where a human on Earth may live well past 250, a Ringworlder may live past 2,000. Maybe with no upward limit at all. The flying station made its way back to heaven. Lewis needed the Shadow Square string, but in the process of obtaining it, Nessus lost his head. Literally. The natives attacked and drove Nessus to run through a trap they had set up with the impossibly sharp string. Nessus fell for the trap and ran right into a length of the string, cutting his head off. Or one of them, anyway. Lewis saved him and got his body back to the station where he hooked it up with Nessus's Fly Cycle's first aid kit. Now they had to get him back to the Lying Bastard before he died. In the Lyre, there was an auto dock that would repair Nessus. It took months of travel to get back to the Lyre, however. The speed of the station was much slower than their trip outwards, each on their own fly cycle. But eventually they made it. The first aid kit must have put Nessus into some sort of suspended animation because he was still alive somehow. But they were still stranded. How would they get the Lyre moved 500,000 miles and then up and over a 1,000-foot wall? Well, Lewis had an idea. After this, Tila departed with Seeker, off to see the entire Ringworld before they die, a feat that will require at least a few thousand years. And, with a little fanfare, they were gone. It seems that Tila actually was lucky after all. Nessus's breeding program worked. She became the first person in known space to become an immortal resident of the biggest landmass in the galaxy, led around and protected by her immortal Giga-Chad husband. Prill decided that she was tired of playing God to savages and made the decision to come back to Earth with Lewis. If they could get off the Ringworld, that is. Their ship's thrusters had been destroyed by the asteroid defense system, but the ship still had a hyperdrive. The problem is, you can't activate a hyperdrive while you are too close to the singularity of a large mass, e.g., inside a solar system. It could only be activated in deep space. Lewis used the Shadow Square wire to attach the station to the Lyre. He then drove the station to the giant mountain they had seen when they first crashed, the mountain the natives called the Fist of God. Lewis thought he knew what the mountain was. When he was in the map room of heaven, he had looked for it and could not find it. A mountain that big should have been easy to find, but it could not be found. So, maybe it wasn't a mountain after all. Once the station reached the top of the giant mountain, Lewis was proven right. It was actually a giant asteroid impact from below, forcing the Ringworld Foundation up thousands of feet until it could no longer contain the force and the asteroid broke through. The crater was high enough that air did not escape out of the hole, but it was still just a hole, and when the station tumbled over the edge, it was flung out into space and pulled the Lying Bastard with it at fast enough speed to fling it out into deep space where they could activate the hyperdrive. Well, that's it for this video. If you're curious about the hyperdrive, or the Slaver stasis fields, or if you just want to know who actually built the Ringworld, go ahead and subscribe and click the bell so you are notified when I put out videos on those subjects, because they're all in the works. Thanks for staying this long, I really appreciate it. And if you want more sci-fi content, you can look through my other videos, or might I suggest taking a look at one of my favorite channels, gee, I wonder why, That 70s Rock Fan. He has a sci-fi book playlist that I highly recommend. The link is in the description.